we are all just so individual, and we each need to find a way to listen
Hmm.
to the felt sense, to what feels right in this moment in terms of movement or action or stillness. Um, and that's very exciting that, like, yeah, there are all these practices and protocols and ways to approach the body, but ultimately it's each individual that has to feel their way through it. Um, and that's just like very mysterious and cool.
Yeah. Oh, and I love so much of what I hear and what you were just saying makes me think too about why embodying parts feels important. And I something very simply that came to me as you were talking is this idea that to fully honor a part as therapists, as coaches, as healers, whatever our like particular role is in that space, to fully honor a part and a full system, that we want to allow for as many expressions to be recognized as possible. And recognizing that, expression might come in the form of a sound, it might come in the form of a movement, maybe it comes as an image, right? But that if we can create as many different avenues for that expression, then we are really supporting someone's system. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then it doesn't always need to just be verbal.
Right, right.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a different way of being, like verbal processing kind of convinces our nervous system that things are linear. And when you drop down into the body, it very quickly becomes clear that it's not linear at all. And that, yeah, that it's about finding finding a sense of security, finding a sense of expression in the moment in your cells. And uh, that is just such a different orientation
Mm.
towards oneself and one's struggles than, okay, I just need to think about this and figure it out. And those, thinking parts are so helpful. Those are the parts that get us to therapy and, get us moving in the right direction. But yeah, if there is enough space for those thinking parts to relax, there's like this whole world of self energy to drop into and, play and experiment inside. And I think that's what we both are so excited about with this work.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you named self energy because that's another thing that I know we've talked about in developing this group and thinking about what practices feel important to include is, of course, the ongoing debate, I think, in the IFS community and a lot of folks that are receiving IFS or practicing IFS is what is self, right? And how do we experience self? How do we know we're experiencing self? And you can have sure those kind of like that basic set of criteria of, well, if you're trying to fix, if you're trying to change, da da da, you're probably that's not self depart. But beyond that, something that I know we've talked about is what is it like to experience embodied self, right? And how are there different frameworks? And I like that we use the word orientation. Are there slightly different orientations we can use to really understand what embodied self could be?
Mhm.
And to me, in a lot of ways, it's kind of tapping into that deep sense of creativity that allows us to have relationship with parts that it in many ways is beyond the cognitive realm. Um, and I know for a lot of people, when you start stepping into potentially that very abstract state, it can be very confusing. And so for a lot of these things that are maybe more expressive therapies, more movement therapies, more somatic therapies, it's giving us more frameworks for understanding what embodied self is
Mhm. Mhm.
that help us understand, like, yes, there is self. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah, and I love what you're saying because I feel like that is a big motivation for me with this class that we're teaching is helping folks who find this idea of self energy so abstract and so sort of ephemeral, like hard to reach, intangible, um, and using embodiment practices to make self energy not so subtle, you know. So, doing self massage practices, shaking, moving for the sake of moving, right? And that starts to give us information. It starts to wake up our container and our insides, and we start to feel a little bit more. We start to become more aware because we're actually physically touching or moving our bodies. And that starts to light things up so that self energy becomes more tangible. It becomes something that the person can say, okay, I can actually feel this in my foot right now, or, you know, I feel this warm presence around my heart space, or however it shows up. But I think that is a big reason why I'm so attracted to movement, when it comes to IFS, because I do feel like it just illuminates the self energy, and not just the self energy in one individual, but the self energy field that we share,
mhm,
um, with and amongst each other. It's like, oh, okay, like this is actually maybe this huge football field that we can um, step into. It doesn't have to be this mysterious, unknowable thing.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that I'm noticing in what you're saying too is like that relational piece,
Mm,
right? And I think that increasingly a lot of folks within the IFS community are writing more and talking more about how this isn't just about, inner work, how really recognizing that, we are parts in the broader context of our communities, of our world, right? There's systems upon systems. It becomes very fractal. And what do you do when that is a concept, but it's not an embodied experience,
mm,
right? And so, how do we start doing work with ourselves first, right? Personal practice. But then also, when we go into the room with a client that we're working with, how do we start really understanding what is the relational sense between me and this other person? And beyond that, what is the relational sense of how this person is existing in context with all of their systems, right? And if we can have more and more practices that we're doing with ourselves within our relational systems, then all of a sudden you start to be able to see a lot easier through felt sense, through imagined context, how that person's system is tied and interacting with so many other systems. And I think it's in some ways like it feels more tangible to do somatic work when you're thinking about relational systems and IFS than when you're
mhm,
just thinking about concepts or talking to parts about how they feel about other people's parts.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us therapists end up with self-like managers. These are parts of us, protective parts of us that get blended really easily and often, as we step into the role of being a therapist or a helper or a healer of any kind. And that those parts that they want to make us look good, and they want to sound smart, and they want to seem empathetic and kind and helpful, and they have such good intentions. But sometimes those parts can also kind of block us off from actually just relaxing back and feeling our own self energy. And um, it takes courage, I think, to, as a healer, recognize that you need to do your own work.
Mm. Hmm.
It's vulnerable, right? It's really vulnerable to step out of I'm competent and helpful and into I am present, I am feeling, I am seeing, I am sensing, and I'm here with you. It's just so different. It's so different. And stuff comes up, right? When we go inside, we find parts, we find suffering, we find joy as well, but we all have burdened parts. It's very rare that someone's system is just completely unburdened. Um, and so doing that work, taking that time to really get to know your own system and to go through that vulnerable process of feeling and exploring, I think it's a huge game changer when it comes to working with other people because like you're saying it there's something about that process that just helps you see where other people are at and what they're dealing with.
Yeah. And it's that thing too, right? Of like, why would you ask anyone to go into this dark, wooded forest that's potentially filled with monsters as a form of healing when like you've never walked through the forest or you haven't walked repeatedly through the forest and met your own monsters and learned how to love your own monsters and care for them?
Right, right.
It's like